Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. I kind of don't want to hit the bell too hard because it is pretty near the mic and might be deafening. Who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Renee, Indiana, Joe in the Inland Bar, Jehud in South Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Lucy in Minnesota, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Frank in San Pedro, Elise in Virginia, Nancy in North Carolina, Lester in Florida, and Lynn saying hello from Canada. Welcome everybody. Also Annette in Fort Lay? Fort Lay? Is that, what's Fort Lay? Is that Fort Lauderdale? Great to be with you, everybody. Pardon me, I'm gonna keep it moving because I'm giving a talk tonight, an evening with the accidental Talmudist in Long Beach. That begins in 2 hours, and if all goes well and it's a 45-minute drive and there's no problems like there shouldn't be problems, everything is great. But I want to give myself, not come too close to the edge, get myself out on the road as soon as possible so I can get down there and be on time for that evening. If you're in Long Beach, I'd love to see you there. And if you want to bring me to your city, reach out and let's talk. I do all kinds of scholar in residence, Shabbaton, an evening with the accidental Talmudist, screening of Guns N' Moses, sharing jokes from the joke book. Too many hats that I wear, but it makes me able to do different kinds of evenings with audiences. And I love being together with audiences in person. Okay, so our daf tonight is page 4. We did a double yesterday. We really only got to the top of page 3b. So our daf is page 4 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud, but we're picking it up near the top of page 3b. We're continuing our discussion of a meal offering that would be disqualified according, or let's say that would not fulfill, would not affect acceptance, would not fulfill a vow if the person vowed to bring a meal offering, if when the handful was removed by the priest from the meal offering, if it was done for the sake of something that was not this offering, either for the sake of a different kind of meal offering or for the sake of a different owner, etc. At that point, it doesn't work. If it was the meal offering of a sinner, it would be fully disqualified. It doesn't complete its journey to the altar. If it was not the meal offering of a sinner, it could complete its journey to the altar and be credited to the owner as some kind of a gift offering, but it would not fulfill, if he had vowed to bring an offering, he would still have to bring another offering. Now, Rabbi Shimon, in the minority opinion that we don't paskin like, we don't follow his minority view, he said that, actually, if you remove the handful or do some other aspect of the offering procedure for the sake of a different offering, not only is it not disqualified, but the owner actually does fulfill his obligation. It does affect acceptance for him. And yet, then in a Baraisa, we see that Rabbi Shimon has two views that contradict each other. At one point, he says, well, if it was done in the wrong way, it does fulfill the obligation of the owner. If it was done in the wrong way, it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. And so because he contradicts himself, other sages are spending quite a bit of time, Rava, and Rava Ashi, trying to explain how Rabbi Shimon, who's obviously a great sage, he wouldn't just mistakenly contradict himself. It must be that he's talking about different situations. So one approach to this was, well, it would affect acceptance for him if the priest had in mind a different kind of meal offering, but for the same owner. Then, it's still a meal offering. He still had in mind to bring a meal offering, so it affects acceptance for him. But if the priest had in mind that he's taking the handful from a meal offering of a different person, of a different owner, a change of owner rather than a change of type of offering, then it would not affect acceptance for him. So that was one of the approaches to reconcile the apparent contradiction of Rabbi Shimon's own statements, his own two statements that contradict each other. And something just, 30,000 feet look at this, it's beautiful. It's spectacularly beautiful that the sages are spending so much time trying to understand the view of Rabbi Shimon and why he might have contradicted himself, but didn't really contradict himself, when in fact it's the minority view, right? So just like the Supreme Court will issue a decision, and there's going to be the majority of the justices, so that's the majority, that becomes the law. And we preserve the minority opinion of those who dissent, the dissenting opinion. We don't follow that as the law, but we preserve their opinion, how they arrived at their view. But, in law schools, they don't spend so much time studying the minority view. They spend more time on what became the law. I'm sure they do study minority views, but here we're really going deep on that minority view that is not the law, but we still need to understand it. Okay, now near the top of page 3b. The Gemara cites another resolution for the apparent contradiction between the two baraisas that report conflicting opinions of Rabbi Shimon. Rava said, La kasha, it's not difficult. Here, where Rabbi Shimon says that a meal offering that was sacrificed not for its own sake fulfills the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of a meal offering. A different meal offering, but it's still a meal offering. There, where he says that it does not fulfill the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of a slaughtered offering, meaning an animal offering. Why would you remove the handful from a meal offering for the sake of a slaughtered offering? This would indicate that there was an animal offering being brought, that is the principal, the important part of an offering, and there was a meal offering being brought as an accompaniment, as an accessory to the main offering. This could happen where there are certain communal offerings that are also accompanied by loaves, or, for example, if somebody brings a korban todah, right, a thanks offering, like somebody who survived, an accident or an attack by bandits or something like that. His life was in danger. He survived. He wants to say thank you to God. And part of the Thanksgiving offering is to bring an animal offering and 40 loaves, right? Then there's going to be different kinds of loaves of bread, some leavened, some unleavened. That can include a meal offering, right? So what he's saying is, well, but if you're bringing it for the sake of a different offering altogether, well, that's not going to work, right? One was just a meal offering. This is now you're removing the handful for the sake of not a proper meal offering in itself, but just an accompanying meal offering. That's going to disqualify the offering, according to this explanation of why Rabbi Shimon seemed to contradict himself. No, he was talking about two different situations. And Rava elaborates. If one removes a handful from a meal offering, remember, removing the handful from a meal offering is sort of like slaughtering and collecting the blood of an animal offering, and then when you put it in a service vessel, and you put that flour, right, that ground flour, fine flour, onto the altar pyre. That's like sprinkling the blood and putting the sacrificial portions on the altar, right? The meal offering, it's not an animal, but we can sort of analogize its different components of the sacrificial process. Okay, so says Rabbah, if one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of a different meal offering, he fulfills his obligation. As the verse states, quote, and this is the law of the meal offering, Leviticus 6:7. And this indicates that there is one law for all the meal offerings, meaning they are all considered variations of the same offering and are different only with regard to how they should be sacrificed ab initio. Conversely, if one sacrificed a meal offering for the sake of a slaughtered offering, since the phrase, and this is the law of the meal offering and the slaughtered offering, is not written anywhere, that phrase does not exist in the Torah, there is no reason to conclude that one would fulfill his obligation under those circumstances. Now, the Gemara questions how Rava can say that the verse, and this is the law of the meal offering, serves as the basis for the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. But doesn't the Tana, meaning Rabbi Shimon, he's a Tana because he's a sage from the period in history of the Mishna, as opposed to Rava, who's an Amora, because he's from the period in history corresponding to when the Gemara was being compiled. Okay, so but doesn't the Tana say that this reasoning is that for any particular meal offering, its mode of preparation proves what it is? And the Gemara explains that this is what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Even though sacrificing a meal offering for the sake of a different meal offering is a case where it is not recognizable that the intention fits the offering, i.e. the intent does not match the rites being performed, and the offering should therefore be disqualified, the verse states, quote, and this is the law of the meal offering, which teaches that there is one law for all the meal offerings. And what does Rabbi Shimon mean when he says, but with regard to slaughtering off slaughtered offerings, it is not so? This clause indicates that the similarity between the rites of various slaughtered offerings is a reason why they should not be valid, whereas according to the above reasoning, the opposite is so. And the Gemara explains this part of Rabbi Shimon's statement. Even though there is one manner of slaughter for all animal offerings, and therefore one might think that the owner has fulfilled his obligation despite having improper intent, the phrase, and this is the law of the meal offering and the slaughtered offering, is not written, doesn't exist. In other words, it is not stated, this is the law of a slaughtered offering, in the manner that we have a verse which states, this is the law of the meal offering. Therefore, the owner of a slaughtered offering does not fulfill his obligation if there is improper intent, notwithstanding the similarity between the acts of slaughter. We only have such a verse for the meal offering, and so according to this view, that's why Rabbi Shimon might say that even though you had intent for a different meal offering when you slaughtered this meal, when you removed the handful for this meal offering, it's going to affect acceptance. We don't extend that view to animal offerings because we don't have a verse that would support extending that view in that manner. The Gemara asks, if that is so, that the phrase, and this is the law of the meal offering, teaches that a meal offering is not disqualified despite the improper intent where the priest had in mind a different meal offering, then, analogously, a sin offering brought to atone for eating forbidden fat that one slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering to atone for consuming blood. In other words, somebody had to bring a sin offering. When do you bring a sin offering? Because you unwittingly violated a prohibition in the Torah, like, eating something that's not kosher, whether it's a forbidden fat, or you didn't drain the blood properly before you, made a steak. And so those are two different prohibitions. So even though the sin offering might be the very same sin offering, but it was being brought to atone for the wrong sin, right? You committed two sins. You had two offerings that you were going to bring, one for this sin and one for that sin, and then they got confused, and so it was slaughtered for the sake of the wrong sin, not what the owner's intent was, and that would disqualify it, right? Or for the sake of a sin offering to atone for idol worship, or for the sake of the sin offering of a Nazir. Now, these are sin offerings that are brought at the conclusion of Naziris, not to atone for a sin, but just because certain sin offerings are required to complete one's vow of Naziris, or for the sake of the sin offering of a Mitzorah, who's being purified after he had that skin condition. Therefore, you might think that these should be valid and affect acceptance because it's the same kind of offering, even though it's being brought for a different sin. As the Merciful One states, and this is the law of the sin offering, from which it should be derived that there is one law for all sin offerings. But we remember from Tractate Zevachim, that's not the case. If you have in mind to atone for the wrong sin when you bring a different sin offering, it's going to be disqualified, right? So the Gemara responds, according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, yes, that would work. According to the minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon, if it was the exact same animal sin offering just being brought for, and it was brought with intent for a different sin than the owner intended, that would not disqualify, and it would affect atonement for him. According to Rabbi Shimon, according to this view of what Rabbi Shimon was saying, according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, such a sin offering is indeed valid, and it does affect acceptance for its owner. And the Gemara notes, and according to the rabbis, the majority, Rava says, a sin offering brought to atone for eating forbidden fat, that one slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering to atone for consuming blood, or for the sake of a sin offering to atone for committing idolatry, is valid. What? Rav is saying that the majority says if you slaughter a sin offering animal for the sake of the wrong sin, not the one that the owner intended, it would affect atonement for him. That's what Rav just said. But if he slaughtered it for the sake of a sin offering of a Nazir, or for the sake of the sin offering of a Mitzorah, it would be disqualified because one is affecting atonement for a sin, the other is just completing a purification ritual. And therefore, if you had the wrong intent across that divide, it would be disqualified. As with regard to these offerings, there are burnt offerings brought together with them. Now, Rav Acha, the son of Rava, teaches that Rava holds that the law in all these cases is not what we just said. In fact, it is disqualification of the sin offering. If it was slaughtered for the sake of the wrong sin, it does disqualify the sin offering. And the reason is that the verse states, and slaughter it for a sin offering, and the word it indicates that it must be sacrificed for the sake of a particular sin offering, and it may not be slaughtered for the sake of a different one. Next topic. The Gemara cites a third resolution of the apparent contradiction between the two baraisas that support the conflicting opinions of Rabbi Shimon. Rav Ashi said, no, it's not difficult. Here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering remains fit if the handful was removed for the sake of a different meal offering, and it does fulfill the obligation of the owner. So, according to Rav Ashi, Rabbi Shimon is referring to a case where one states that he is removing a handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan. Not for the sake of a deep pan offering, but he only says, the words that come out of his mouth is, I am removing a handful from the shallow pan offering for the sake of a deep pan. He didn't say it's for the sake of some other offering. He's only referring to the vessel. Because of that, it's as if he didn't say anything at all. Where he's only talking about vessels. He's not talking about what the meal offering is brought to atone for, or he's not talking about what offering it's brought to fulfill, what vow it's brought to fulfill. All he talked about is that he's using one vessel for another vessel. It's as if he didn't say anything at all. But there, where Rabbi Shimon says that taking the handful for the wrong meal offering will not fulfill the owner's obligation, he says that, or he's talking about a situation in which the priest says he is removing a handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, right? He specifically said that he uttered his mistake out loud. That he's bringing one kind of meal off, he's removing a handful from a meal offering for the sake of the wrong meal offering, a different meal offering. Now, I did a little bit of reading just so I could help us understand this better. In terms of what is the difference between a shallow pan meal offering and a deep pan meal offering. It's not that, shallow pan offerings are for somebody bringing the meal offering of a sinner, and deep pan meal offerings are for somebody bringing, let's say, a voluntary meal offering. It's not that the type of vessel the meal offering is brought in corresponds to a particular type of meal offering necessarily. What it is more like this. Let's say you're bringing a sin offering. Now, a sin offering could be a lamb or a goat, right? Either one can affect acceptance for you as long as it's, the right age, the right gender, and then it's slaughtered properly and for the sake of the correct offering, etc. All the sacrificial procedure has to be done right. But you have a choice. You could do it with a lamb or with a goat, right? Now, if you vowed to bring a lamb for your sin offering and then you brought a goat, so then it might be disqualified, right? You could have gone either way. But when you vowed to bring that sin offering, you chose. And so now you have to stay with it, right? Or let's say it was a peace offering. You vowed to bring a peace offering, or you vowed to bring a thanks offering. Same idea. Because in your vow you specified which animal you were going to bring, then you have to fulfill your vow. Likewise, when you're bringing a meal offering, the cost is much lower, whatever it is, a pound of flour, not a whole animal, But if, you don't have to, but if you then, at the time that you made a vow that you were going to bring this offering, you said, I'm going to bring a shallow pan offering, or you said you're going to bring a deep pan offering, okay, because you vowed to bring one or the other, now you have to fulfill the terms of your vow. And then if you brought the wrong kind of offering, it's like analogous to you said sheep and you brought a goat, or vice versa. You said shallow pan and you brought deep pan, and that might be one the rationale for the disqualification. Okay, so let's keep reading. Now Rav Ashi elaborates, when one bringing a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan, he didn't say this, a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering. He just uttered nonsense. He said a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan. Since he didn't say one offering for a different kind of offering, he just mumbled basically. It doesn't matter, and so that's why it'll affect acceptance. He has intent only with regard to the type of vessel, and intention with regard to the type of vessel will not disqualify offerings, as he's not sacrificing the vessel. And therefore the owner's obligation could be fulfilled according to Rabbi Shimon. By contrast, when he states that he is removing a handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, he has intent with regard to the type of meal offering, which improper intention would disqualify. Consequently, the owner's obligation would not be fulfilled. This is another way of explaining why Rabbi Shimon says sometimes taking the handful for the wrong type of offering, nevertheless would still fulfill the owner's obligation, and another time Rabbi Shimon says it would not. It might be that, well, in one case he only talked about the vessels, and in another case he talked about the wrong kind of offering. Now the Gemara questions how Rav Ashi could maintain that this is the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon, and to explain why he seemingly contradicts himself. But doesn't the Tana, i.e. Rabbi Shimon, say that his reasoning is that for any particular meal offering, its mode of preparation proves what it is? Right? What difference does it make what he says? Either he brought a shallow pan meal offering or he brought a deep pan meal offering, and we can ignore his words because it's obvious what he brought. And the Gemara explains that this is what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Even though when he removes a handful from a shallow pan meal offering explicitly for the sake of a deep pan, it is a case where the falseness of the intention is recognizable, and the offering should therefore be disqualified. It is nevertheless valid and fulfills the owner's obligation, as intentions with regard to the type of vessel are irrelevant. Now, what they're going to get into is, well, if his action obviously contradicts, now we're talking about the owner of the offering, if his actions obviously contradict what his stated intention was, Rabbi Shimon says, okay, so we just ignore what his stated intention was because we follow the action, right? It's like the cards speak on a poker table. But other sages are going to say, well, if his actions obviously contradict what came out of his mouth, that's not a reason to accept the offering. That's not a reason to effect acceptance. That's a reason to disqualify the offering. Let's see how this goes. The Gemara asks, and what does Rabbi Shimon mean when he says, but with regard to slaughtered offerings, it is not so, because the slaughter is always the same. So you have to look to the mind of the priest. That's where it matters, because there is no difference in the action. They're all slaughtered in the same way, right? He means that even though there is one manner of slaughter for all offerings, and one manner of sprinkling of the blood for all offerings, and one manner of collection of the blood for all offerings, i.e., if one performs any of these rites for the sake of a different offering, it would not be visibly recognizable that his intent is false, and therefore it might have been thought that the owner would fulfill his obligation. Nevertheless, he has improper intent with regard to an aspect of slaughtering, such as slaughtering a burnt offering for the sake of a peace offering, which improper intention would disqualify, right? That's the difference, according to this analysis, between animal offerings and meal offerings. So Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, if this is the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon, then with regard to a case where one removes a handful from a dry meal offering, no oil at all, just the powder flour, for the sake of a meal offering that is mixed with oil, why did Rabbi Shimon say that it would fulfill the owner's obligation? Since his intent concerns the meal offering itself, it should disqualify the offering according to this most recent version of our analysis. So Rav Ashi said to him, when Rabbi Shimon says that such a meal offering does fulfill the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one removes a handful merely for the sake of mixing, not for the sake of a meal offering mixed with oil. And the Gemara challenges this and says, well, if so, then when one slaughters a burnt offering for the sake of a peace offering as well, one can say that his intent is merely for the sake of peace, shlamim, between himself and God. Why then does Rabbi Shimon say that this burnt offering does not fulfill the obligation of the owner? Now the Gemara rejects this challenge outright. How can these cases be compared? There the offering is itself called a shalamim, a peace offering, as it is written, who sacrifices the blood of the peace offering. And it is also written, who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering in Leviticus 7:14. Here, by contrast, is a meal offering itself called mixed? They're just called meal offerings. It is written, and every meal offering mixed with oil, indicating that there is a meal offering that is called mixed with oil, but there is not a different meal offering that is simply called mixed. So one's intent to sacrifice a dry meal offering for the sake of mixing is therefore not a reference to the offering itself. It doesn't affect the nomenclature of that type of offering. Now, let's review. The Gemara is going to review a little bit because this material is really, really tough. So the Gemara itself is going to review. 3 resolutions have been suggested for the apparent contradiction between the statements of Rabbi Shimon in 2 baraisas concerning whether or not a meal offering whose handful was removed, not for its own sake, will or will not fulfill the obligation of its owner. Rabbah's answer was that there is a difference between intent for another meal offering, in which case the owner would fulfill his obligation, as the intent is recognizably improper, and intent for someone else, which is not recognizably improper, right? If that priest removes a handful of a meal offering thinking he's doing it for Joe, when in fact this offering was brought by Tom, the only reason we would know that he has the wrong intent is because of his mental state. Whereas if he knows he's bringing it on Joe for Joe, but he was intending to bring a deep pan offering, and instead he did a shallow pan offering. Okay, well, we see visibly that he did the wrong kind of offering, but it was for the same person, and so this might be a reason why Rabbi Shimon says yes in one case and no in the other. And the Gemara comments about this. All the other sages, meaning Rava and Rav Ashi, right? We have 3 views trying to reconcile Rabbi Shimon's seeming contradiction, Rava, and Rav Ashi, right? So that was Rabba's answer. There's a difference between for the sake of the wrong kind of meal offering for the same owner versus for the sake of a meal offering from a different person. One case, it does affect acceptance for the owner. In the other case, it doesn't. That's how Rabbah reconciles Rabbi Shimon's contradiction. But the other sages, Rava and Rav Ashi, do not say, as Rabbah did in resolving the contradiction, right? They don't agree with Rabbah. Why? Because they do not accept his reasoning, claiming that on the contrary, the merciful one disqualifies recognizably false intent. They say, well, if the priest's action contradicts what he's intending to do, that's not a reason to allow this offering to work for its owner. That's a reason to disqualify this offering. And the Gemara explains, Rava resolved the contradiction by saying that a meal offering from which a handful was removed for the sake of a different meal offering does affect acceptance for the owner, right? So that's one of the views of Rabbi Shimon, and he's agreeing with Rabbah, but he's going to give a different reason. Why? Not because of the recognizably false intent should not disqualify, but rather because Leviticus 6:7 states, and this is the law of the meal offering, indicating that there is one law for all meal offerings. So as long as he had in mind the meal offering, doesn't matter that it was the wrong meal offering, it's not going to disqualify and it's going to still affect acceptance for the owner. Rabbah and Rav Ashi, they don't agree with Rabbah on this. Why? Because the verse states, and this is the law of the meal offering, does not indicate to them that there should be one law for all meal offerings. It's an interesting law and we learn something from it, but what we're not going to learn from it is that, well, then therefore all meal offerings are interchangeable. They're not. So now the Gemara continues to the third view of how we reconcile Rabbi Ashi's two contradictory views. Rav Ashi resolved the contradiction by saying that when one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of a vessel, right? In other words, just meaningless chatter, the meal offering does affect acceptance for the owner, as intent concerning the vessel itself is inconsequential. Whereas when one removes a handful for the sake of a different meal offering, then the meal offering would not fulfill the owner's obligation. Rabba and Rava did not agree with Rav Ashi in resolving the contradiction because of the difficulty that was posed by Rav Acha, the son of Rava, from a case where one removes a handful of a dry meal offering for the sake of a mixed one. And Rabbi Shimon holds that such a meal offering does fulfill the owner's obligation, even though his intent concerns the meal offering itself, not the vessel, which would contradict what Rav Ashi said. Now the Gemara notes the matter that is obvious to Rabbah in one way, i.e. that with regard to meal offerings and a recognizably false intention, it's obvious that because of the type of meal offering that the priest separated, that's different than what he stated he was going to do. That's recognizably false intention. Therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon, in the view of Rabbah, that's why we just disregard what his intention was and we just follow the action. But when the false intention is not visibly recognizable, then we do have to take into account the intent that the priest had in his head, and that's why we would disqualify the offering. And that is obvious to Rava in the other way, i.e. that in cases of recognizably false intention, that's the reason to disqualify the offering and not fulfill the owner's obligation. But this is a dilemma for Rav Hoshaya. Okay? Bringing in a new guy. What does Rav Hoshaya say? Rav Hoshaya raises a dilemma. And some say that Rav Hoshaya raises the dilemma before Rav Asi. In the case of one who sacrifices a meal offering for the sake of a slaughtered offering, right? Now he had in mind the wrong kind of offering, and instead of a meal offering that's being brought for itself, he had in mind that this is a meal he's separating the handful from a meal offering that is actually an accompaniment to an animal offering. Big difference and a reason to disqualify. Now we're at the top of page 4a. So what should I understand that Rabbi Shimon says with regard to such a case? Is the reason of Rabbi Shimon, who says that a meal offering from which a handful was removed for the sake of another meal offering is valid and affects acceptance, that intent that is recognizably false does not disqualify an offering? And if so, this meal offering from which a handful is removed for the sake of an animal offering is also a case of intent that is recognizably false, and therefore the meal offering should not be disqualified. If it's obvious that there's an animal offering being brought at the same time, clearly, okay, we can see that the intent was recognizably false, and according to the view, that recognizably false action compared to intent won't disqualify. Or perhaps the reason of Rabbi Shimon is that it is written, and this is the law of the meal offering, which indicates that there is one law for all meal offerings, so as long as you had in mind a different meal offering, we don't disqualify. If so, then a meal offering from which a handful was removed for the sake of an animal offering should be disqualified. Since it's not one meal offering for another, we're bringing in a whole other kind of offering, an animal offering. Since it is not written, and this is the law of the meal offering and the slaughtered offering, that doesn't exist in the Torah, so we should disqualify. Rav Asi said to Rav Hoshaya, have we ascertained the depth of the opinion of Rabbi Shimon in this matter? In other words, we don't know Rabbi Shimon's reasoning. We're guessing. And the Gemara explains why Rav Asi did not resolve this dilemma. Rav Asi did not resolve the dilemma of Rav Hoshaya in accordance with the resolution stated by Rabbah, that there is a distinction between one who removes a handful of a meal offering for the sake of another meal offering and one who removes it for the sake of another owner, because of the difficulty posed by Abaye on page 2b that we covered yesterday, that the law of both of these cases is derived from the same comparison in the Torah between meal offerings and animal offerings. Likewise, Rav Asi did not resolve the dilemma in accordance with the resolution stated by Rava, that the verse, and this is the law of the meal offering, teaches that a meal offering from which a handful was removed for the sake of another meal offering is valid, whereas a meal offering from which a handful was removed for the sake of an animal offering is disqualified. He didn't resolve it that way because of the difficulty arising from the verse, quote, and this is the law of the sin offering, i.e., despite this verse, the law is that a sin offering that was slaughtered for the sake of another sin offering is not valid and doesn't complete its journey to the altar, is fully disqualified. So finally, Rav Asi did not resolve the dilemma in accordance with the resolution stated by Rav Ashi, that there is a distinction between one who removes a handful of a meal offering prepared in one vessel for the sake of a different vessel, which is meaningless chatter, and one who removes it for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a different vessel because of the difficulty posed by Rav Acha, the son of Rava. This difficulty concerns a case where one removes a handful of a dry meal offering for the sake of one mixed with oil, which seems like very similar to the first case and a different outcome. So Rabbi Shimon holds that such a meal offering is valid, despite the fact that the person's intent referred to the meal offering itself, not the vessel. Next topic. The Mishnah, we're back to our Mishnah. Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Menachos. The Mishnah teaches that all meal offerings from which a handful was removed, not for their sake, but rather for the sake of another meal offering, are fit for sacrifice, meaning they don't fulfill the obligation of the owner, but he will be credited with a gift offering, and so they complete their journey to the altar. This applies to all meal offerings, except the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy, of the sota, right? Right, so all meal offerings from which a handful was removed, not for their sake, but for the sake of another meal offering, are fit for sacrifice, except for the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy. And the Gemara asks, granted, the meal offering of a sinner is disqualified when a handful is removed from it, not for its own sake, as the merciful one calls it, a sin offering. In the verse, he shall put no oil upon it, neither shall he put any frankincense upon it, for it is a sin offering. And he shall bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take his handful. Right, this is the meal offering of the sinner, which a poor person can bring because he is obligated to bring a sin offering because he unwittingly violated a prohibition that would bear a karas penalty if he did it on purpose, and he can't afford to bring an animal offering or a bird offering. This verse indicates that just as a sin offering is disqualified when sacrificed not for its own sake, in the case of animals, so too the meal offering of a sinner is disqualified when a handful is removed from it not for its own sake. But with regard to the meal offering of jealousy, from where do we derive that this is the law, that if the handful was removed not for its own sake, it becomes fully disqualified and we're not going to put it on the altar? The Gemara answers that this law may be derived from a baraisa, as a Tana taught a baraisa before Rav Nachman. With regard to money that was designated for a meal offering of jealousy, its surplus, i.e. the money remaining after the purchase of the meal offering, what do you do with it? It's consecrated, right? You set aside this money to purchase the meal offering of jealousy. You were able to purchase it for less than the amount of money you consecrated, but that money does not go back into your pocket. It's consecrated. It belongs to God. It belongs to the Holy Temple. What do you do with it? You use it to purchase gift offerings, communal gift offerings. You can put it in a contribution box at the Holy Temple for that purpose. Rav Nachman said to him, you are saying well. As it is written with regard to the meal offering of jealousy, bring iniquity to remembrance in Numbers 5:15. And it is written with regard to a sin offering, and he has given it you to bear the iniquity of the congregation in Leviticus 10:17. So we draw a verbal analogy between the two uses of the term iniquity in these verses. And this teaches that, just as in the case of a sin offering, its surplus is used to purchase communal gift offerings, so too, with regard to a meal offering of jealousy, its surplus is used to purchase communal gift offerings. And a meal offering of jealousy is also like a sin offering in one other aspect. Just as a sin offering is disqualified when sacrificed not for its own sake, So too, a meal offering of jealousy is disqualified when a handful is removed from it, not for its own sake. And the Gemara says, wait a minute. If that is so, that the law of a meal offering of jealousy is derived from a verbal analogy to a sin offering based on the word iniquity, then a guilt offering should also be disqualified if it was sacrificed not for its own sake, as a similar verbal analogy may be derived from the verse that states the iniquity, avon, of the congregation in Leviticus 10:17. With regard to a sin offering, and the verse that states, and shall bear his iniquity, in connection with a guilt offering. But if you recall, in Tractate Zevachim, a sin offering that was slaughtered not for its own sake, fully disqualified, not going to make its way to the altar even as a gift offering. But a guilt offering that was slaughtered not for its own sake will not fulfill the obligation of its owner, but will complete its journey to the altar. Why? Why doesn't the guilt offering get disqualified just as a sin offering would be disqualified if slaughtered not for its own sake? And the Gemara responds, one derives a verbal analogy based on the word iniquity from a verse that likewise uses the term iniquity, but one does not derive a verbal analogy based on the term his iniquity. Avono, that suffix, modifies the word to mean his iniquity, from a verse that uses the term iniquity without the pronoun attachment. And the Gemara asks, what difference is there? Didn't the school of Rabbi Shimon teach the following verbal analogy with regard to tsaras of houses? The verse states, and the priest shall return, veshav, on the seventh day. And another verse concerning the priest's visit 7 days later states, and the priest shall come, uva. So return, veshav, is not the same verb as come, uva, and yet we're going to use the idea that the priest went from one place to the other on this certain day and use the idea interchangeably. This returning and this coming have the same meaning. And one can therefore derive by verbal analogy that the law that applies if the tsaras had spread at the conclusion of the first week applies if it had spread again by the end of the following week. All the more so should a less pronounced difference of one letter between avon and avono not prevent the teaching of a verbal analogy, and therefore, a guilt offering slaughtered not for its sake should have the same result as a sin offering slaughtered not for its own sake. And furthermore, let one derive a verbal analogy through the term his iniquity stated with regard to a guilt offering, and the term his iniquity from the verse concerning the sin offering brought for the iniquity for hearing the voice, i.e. the sin offering of one who takes a false oath that he has no evidence to contribute in a court testimony. As it is written, if he does not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity in Leviticus 5:1. This would be another reason to extend the law of the sin offering to the guilt offering. So rather, it must be that when the verbal analogy was derived, it was derived only with regard to the law that the surplus from the money designated for a meal offering of jealousy is used to purchase communal gift offerings, but we don't extend it to the law that a meal offering of jealousy from which a handful was removed not for its own sake becomes disqualified. And yet, we do hold that way, so how do we get there? And if you would say that there is a principle that there is no partial verbal analogy, well, that principle would not apply in this case, as the merciful one revealed with regard to a sin offering that the law of other offerings may not be derived from this case, as the verse states, and slaughter it for a sin offering in Leviticus 4:33. And this verse indicates that it, i.e. a sin offering, when slaughtered for its own sake, is valid, and when slaughtered not for its own sake, is disqualified, right? There you have the source for why a sin offering slaughtered not for its own sake becomes fully disqualified. But all other sacrificial animals, whether sacrificed for their own sake or not for their sake, are valid. If not slaughtered not for their own sake, they don't affect acceptance or fulfillment of a vow for their owner, but they remain qualified to complete their journey to the altar, not for the sin offering. And the Gemara asks, but if the merciful one revealed that one cannot derive the law of other offerings that were sacrificed not for their sake from a sin offering, then from where do we derive the law that the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy are disqualified when a handful is removed from them not for their sake? We're saying, well, we can't learn out from the animal sin offering anything for other offerings. Why can we learn out from the law of the animal sin offering slaughtered not for its own sake that a handful taken from the meal offering of a sinner not for its own sake would disqualify it? And even more, how would we learn that about the meal offering of jealousy? And the Gemara explains, with regard to a sin offering, what is the reason that it is disqualified when sacrificed not for its own sake? It is because it is written with regard to this offering, it, in a verse discussing the sin offering of the Nasi, right, the head of a tribe. It is a sin offering. And this indicates that a sin offering is valid only when it is sacrificed for its own sake. So too, it is written with regard to them, i.e. the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy, it. We're talking about it, meaning specifically brought for that purpose, it. In the case of the meal offering of a sinner, the verse states, it is a sin offering. And with regard to the meal offering of jealousy, it is written, it is a meal offering of jealousy. And the Gemara says, whoa. But if so, concerning a guilt offering as well, it is written about this offering, it, as it states, it is a guilt offering in Leviticus 7:5. So accordingly, a guilt offering should likewise be disqualified, fully disqualified, no journey to the altar, if it is slaughtered not for its own sake. But that's not how we hold. So the Gemara responds, that term, it, is written with regard to the stage after the burning of the sacrificial portions of a guilt offering, which are intended for burning upon the altar. Yes, it says it is a guilt offering, but it says that pertaining to a different stage of the sacrificial process. As it is stated in the Baraisa, one derives from the word it, that if the offering was slaughtered not for its own sake, it is disqualified only in the case of a sin offering. But concerning a guilt offering, it is stated about this offering, it is a guilt offering only with regard to the stage after the burning of the sacrificial portions, that part of the offering that goes up in smoke on the altar. And the Baraisa adds, one cannot derive that if these portions were burned not for the sake of a guilt offering, then the offering is disqualified, right? We don't hold that way for the guilt offering the way we do for the sin offering. Why? Because the guilt offering itself is valid if its sacrificial portions were not burned upon the altar at all. Why? Because even though it's correct to burn certain parts of an offering on the altar, when has that sacrifice affected atonement or affected acceptance for its owner? When the blood is sprinkled. The sacrificial portions need to be burned, but that's not indispensable to the sacrificial process. And since the phrase, it is a guilt offering, is mentioned after the blood is sprinkled, it's not going to be disqualified if it was slaughtered for the wrong purpose, for this reason. Whereas with the sin offering, it's stated before the sprinkling. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara asks, but if so, why do I need the word it stated with regard to a guilt offering? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary for that which Rav Huna says that Rav says, with regard to a guilt offering whose owner died or whose transgression was otherwise atoned for, and that was therefore consigned by the court to grazing until it develops a blemish so that it can be sold and the proceeds used to purchase a burnt offering. If before it developed a blemish, someone slaughtered it without specification of its purpose, it is fit if it was sacrificed as a burnt offering because it is still a fit offering. It's still a fit animal. Shouldn't have been done, but if it was done, it works after the fact. Doesn't fulfill any obligation. In fact, there is no more obligation because the guy died. And the Gemara infers if it was consigned to grazing, yes, it is fit if it was sacrificed as a burnt offering, if it was slaughtered. By inference, if it was not consigned to grazing, it is not fit. And what is the reason for this? The verse states, it is a guilt offering, indicating that it shall remain as it is, i.e. as a guilt offering, unless it was consigned by the court to another purpose. Meaning, we learn a different lesson from the phrase, it is a guilt offering, than what we learned from the phrase, it is a sin offering, meaning it is a sin offering, it can only be slaughtered for its own sake, and if not, it's fully disqualified. That's where we will knock off. I'll take a couple questions, but note that there is no class tomorrow because the Litvacs are taking a little family trip while our kids are home for the holiday. And so our next class will be Friday at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Lucy, it seems to me that Rabbi Shimon is making the owner less vulnerable to the mental slip-ups of the priest as long as we are still thinking of a meal offering. In a busy temple, it would be easy for a priest to get confused about whose meal offering this is and maybe sometimes not even be aware of the error. Absolutely. Rabbi Shimon's view is more lenient and will result in less problems for the owners and for the priests. It would be nice if we could hold like Rabbi Shimon, but we don't hold like Rabbi Shimon because even though his view from a policy perspective might be more desirable, his reasoning, at least according to the majority, doesn't support this view. And Sharon, I am sure it was much harder to distinguish one meal offering from another as compared to two different animals, right? I mean, the shallow pan and the deep pan, I guess, could be visibly, you could tell. But at the end of the day, this visible difference, right, which is not good enough between animals, and therefore for sure it shouldn't be good enough between pans. And at the end of the day, it's just not a reason to say, well, he had the wrong intent and therefore it's disqualified. The fact that, his actions belie what his intent was, worked for Rabbi Shimon, didn't work for the majority. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, see you on Friday at noon Pacific. Have a good night.